Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the chairman of the Bow Group, Ben Harris Quinney.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could ask you to take your seats, take any refreshments you have to the seats, and we shall begin. Well, a very warm welcome this afternoon from the Bow Group. I'm sure all of you here are very strong supporters of Theresa May's government and support her excellent decision to deem that she had far too many very bright Conservative minds, and therefore Sir Roger Scruton was surplus to requirements. These are strange times in which we meet. Times the Bow Group, which is Britain's oldest Conservative think tank, does not find itself able to support the Conservative Party and such decisions as those that I have mentioned. And it is in times like this that I think it's most important to consider very carefully why we are here, how we became a free and prosperous nation. And we are very fortunate to be alive at the same time as someone I deem to be one of the greatest minds that conservatism has ever seen. Sir Roger began his career on the Soviet underground, promoting freedom of speech and ideas in very dangerous circumstances in the Soviet Union, where such things could certainly have landed him worse than fired from Theresa May's government. But he did so with great courage, and I had the privilege to have lunch with him last year, and it was several weeks after he was no-platformed at Bristol University. And it's a rather extraordinary thing that a man who began his life in great courage, spreading free speech and free ideas in the Soviet Union, is now restricted in speech and ideas in his own country. That's why events like today are so important, where we can say, yes, we want to hear challenging thoughts. Yes, we want to hear visions of how the future could be. We're tired of a managerial class of politicians that base their ideas on the last 5 minutes of polling and not ideologies and traditions that have stood this country in great stead in the past. So I ask you all to join me in welcoming Sir Roger Scruton. A man that deserves to be fired from this country.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm going to read my speech, and I'm hoping that it will be intelligible to everyone here. And there'll be 10 minutes for question and answer at the end of it. Right. Following the conversation as it has been so far today, I recognize that we need to look back into the origins of the European Union and ask ourselves how it came about that European integration was conceived in such one-dimensional terms as a process of ever-increasing unity under a centralized structure of command. But it has been that way. Each increase in central power has to be matched by a diminution of national power. Every summit, every directive, and every click of the ratchet has since carried within itself this specific equation. The political process in Europe has therefore acquired a direction. It is not a direction that the people of Europe have chosen, and every time they are given the right to vote on it, they reject it, as recently in Britain. The process is moving always towards centralization, top-down control, dictatorship by unelected bureaucrats and judges, cancellation of laws passed by elected parliaments, and constitutional treaties framed without any input whatsoever from the people. In short, the process is moving always towards imperial government. And only one thing stands opposed to this result, and that is the national sentiments of the European people. For this reason, national sentiments have been demonized. Speak up for Jeanne d'Arc and Le Pays Réel, for the Sceptred Isle and St. George, for Lemminkainen's gloomy forests and the true Finns who roam in them, and you will be called a fascist, a racist, a populist, and an extremist. There is a liturgy of denunciation here that is repeated all across Europe by a ruling elite that trembles in the face of ordinary loyalties. We see this in the educated contempt directed towards those who supported and maybe still support Brexit, and the fashioning of the label populist as a term of abuse. A populist is a politician who appeals too directly to traditional and rooted loyalties and to sentiments of national belonging. That is something which has become not a crime exactly, but the thing against which the elite of Europe is in permanent opposition. But the fact is that national sentiment is, for most ordinary Europeans, the only motive that will justify sacrifice in the public cause. Insofar as people do not vote to line their own pockets, it is because they also vote to protect a shared identity from the predations of those who do not belong to it. That is the real reason why Viktor Orban does so well in Hungarian elections, why the Law and Justice Party remains so strong in Poland, and why Angela Merkel is facing such a radical challenge from the Alternative für Deutschland. I don't say that those politicians are right in what they do, but it's because they represent the force of popular sentiment, not Angela Merkel, but the other two, that they enjoy the success that they enjoy. What we are now seeing in Europe is that yesterday's radical visions cannot translate into today's political needs. The imperial project has entered into conflict with the only source of sentiment upon which it could conceivably draw for its legitimacy. The nation states are not equally stable, equally democratic, equally free, or equally obedient to the rule of law, but they are all that we have. They alone inspire the loyalty and obedience of the European people, and without them, there is no way that the machinery of the Union can act. By replacing national accountability with distant bureaucracy, that machinery has left people disarmed and bewildered in the face of the changes sweeping across the continent. In a crisis, people take stock, which means that they retreat to the primary source of their social identity and prepare to defend it. They don't do this consciously, but they do it nevertheless, and the futile attempt by the comfortable elites to denounce the extremism of the people whose inheritance they have stolen, or the populism of those who gain the people's favour, merely exacerbates the reaction. But the situation is not a happy one. Not only are there nations like the Flemish and the English which have no nation state of their own, the half-century of peace and prosperity has fed upon the European cultural inheritance without renewing it. The constitutional treaties and transnational courts of the European Union have made a point of granting no favours to the Christian faith, and the spirit of multiculturalism has ensured that national cultures receive no subsidies either from national governments or from the Union itself. A cult of the minority has been imposed from above. Yet all across Europe, multiculturalism is being put in question both by ordinary people and by many of their elected representatives. For while multiculturalism seems to have done nothing to reconcile immigrant communities to their new surroundings, it has destroyed the frail remnants of national cultures that survived the Second World War. This is one reason why people who stand up for their national identity can so easily be made to look like extremists. You don't look like an extremist if you express your national sentiment in the idiom of a Peggy, an Orwell, a Lampedusa, or a Sibelius. But when you have no national icons besides the flag and the football team, you find it difficult to display the most important aspect of national sentiment, which is that it is an invocation of peace and not a cry of war. That is why culture matters, and why its loss in times of crisis is a loss to the whole community, and not just to the educated minority who are aware of the fact. And it is precisely here, in the realm of culture, that the national idea needs to be defined and acknowledged. For European civilization depends far more on national solidarity than on any of the transnational institutions that have emerged from the original plan. This, for me, is the principal task of the conservative intellectual today, to get hold of that national culture and represent it to the people. And this brings me to the question how to defend conservatism, therefore, in the situation in which we now find ourselves. Conservatism starts from a sentiment that all mature people can readily share, the sentiment that good things are easily destroyed, but not easily created. This is especially true of the good things that come to us as collective assets: peace, freedom, law, civility, public spirit, the security of property and family life, in all of which we depend on the cooperation of others while having no means to obtain it. In respect of such things, the work of destruction is quick, easy, and exhilarating. The work of creation, slow, laborious, and dull. That is one of the lessons of the 20th century. It is also one reason why conservatives suffer such a disadvantage when it comes to public opinion. Their position is true but boring, that of their opponents exciting but false. Civil society can be killed from above, but it grows from below. It grows through the associative impulse of human beings, who create civil associations that are not purpose-driven enterprises, but places of freely sustained order. Politicians often try to press these associations into alien molds, making them into instruments for external purposes that may be in conflict with their inner character. This is what happened to state schools in our country when the socialists conscripted them to the pursuit of social equality. It is what happened to universities when governments demanded that they be expanded so as to offer a new rite of passage to the young, a time away from home and family exposed to the relentless and mind-numbing jargon of the left liberal theocracy. It is what happened to all the little platoons of Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech lands when the Communist Party made them into transmission gears for the socialist agenda. It is what is happening to many of our social habits under the jurisdiction of the European human rights machine, which condemns as discrimination all our attempts to maintain our old social, marital, and sexual habits. Not surprisingly, therefore, the conservative position, even if it captures a fundamental experience of social attachment, is no longer secure. Politicians who never ask themselves about the roots of social order, who have no conception of the nation and its moral personality, who look on the legacy of Christian civilization only to laugh at it or to turn in puzzlement away, who fail to notice that marriage and family are the sine qua non of social reproduction. Such politicians have allowed our continent to enter a period of deep uncertainty while effectively preventing the debate that we all of us need, the debate about identity and how we can adapt to its changes. Who are we? What makes us a community? How do we recruit the young to belong to that community? And what do we do with those who refuse? Radical Islam has brought that multifaceted question into the open and been greeted with a predictable silence from the new political class, which is entirely without the means to answer it. It is this silence of the political class that provoked the Brexit vote in my country. As the day of the vote approached, it became clear that people were beginning to see the referendum as an opportunity to express feelings that had been largely excluded from the political process. In his attempt to secure the results on which he had staked his career, David Cameron warned of the economic catastrophe that awaits us should we withdraw from the single market, and he produced one expert after another to prove the point. Not all the voters, however, were persuaded. The experts had a point, but they sounded like people who could settle anywhere and always be on top of things. For such people, it is no great imposition to be governed from elsewhere. Elsewhere is where they always are. For many ordinary voters, however, whose networks are also neighborhoods, the issue of who governs us and from where is real and urgent. For such people, something was at stake that had been systematically overlooked by the politicians, and which was more important to them than all the economic and geopolitical arguments, namely the question of identity. Who are we? Where are we? And what holds us together in a shared political obedience? It is not only the British who have this question, it is the principal political question of our time, and all across Europe, people are beginning to ask it. Identities are many and often compete with each other. I have an identity as a writer, as a philosopher, as a husband and a father. In the various spheres in which I live and act, I recognize constraints, norms, duties, and freedoms that belong to those spheres and provide them with their meaning. In that sense, an identity assigns me to a group. But some groups also act as groups, taking decisions on behalf of their members and requiring the members to accept what is undertaken in their name. Hence, when we act collectively, as in a committee, a team, or a club, we need a clear conception of who belongs with us and why. This conception will define what the members owe to each other and why they are included in the deal. It will be the foundation of the trust on which the collective is built. It is in this sense that politics presupposes a shared identity, a definition of who is included that enables each of us to adopt the decisions that are made in our name. But what happens when trust disintegrates? In particular, what happens when the issues closest to people's hearts are neither discussed nor even mentioned by their representatives, and when these issues are precisely issues of identity, of who we are, who is included, and who is not? This, it seems to me, is where we have got to in Western democracies, in the United States just as much as in Europe. And recent events on both continents would be less surprising if the media and the politicians had woken up earlier to the fact that Western democracies are suffering from a crisis of identity. The we, that is the foundation of trust and the sine qua non of representative government, has been jeopardized, not only by the global economy and the rapid decline of indigenous ways of life, but also by unprecedented levels of migration of people with other languages, other customs, other religions, and other loyalties. Moreover, people cannot question this publicly without risking the charge of racism and xenophobia, and therefore cannot begin the process of coming to terms with it by discussing what the costs and benefits might be. Every kind of intimidation is now deployed in the effort to silence the conservative voice. Traditional conservatism has been hostile to intellectuals, but not always hostile to ideas. And the one idea about which it was absolutely clear was this idea of identity. The point was made at the outset by Burke and Hume. A political community is not a business partnership or a contractual deal. It is a historical settlement bound by custom, loyalty, and a sense of belonging, of a kind that finds its highest expression in a national culture. It depends upon neighborliness and what Burke called the little platoons, and upon the love between generations that only the family can properly sustain. As to what else it requires, what, for example, in the way of religion, schooling, legal order, and sovereignty, this has been the topic of conservative philosophy ever since. Powerful considerations were given for that conception of political identity, not only by Burke and Hume, but by continental thinkers like Mestre and Hegel. Our political class today has, however, fallen under the goal of globalism, according to which the old idea of self-contained nations within definite borders and subject to territorial rule of law is seen as a kind of anachronism. If people cling to that idea as a guarantee of their identity, then a new and global identity is needed in order to win them over from their alien habits. The Brexit vote was an expression, however, of another kind of alienation, and comparable feelings have given rise to the discontent with the European project that we see growing in Italy, Greece, and Spain. In all three of those countries, the political class has seen an easy solution to the problem of governing the people, namely to accept a regime imposed from above so as to collect all the privileges of political life while avoiding all the duties. When Burke wrote his reflections on the French Revolution, he knew that he would be targeted as a public enemy. But he also knew that the political class to which he belonged would be influenced by his arguments and would begin to understand that a society built from below on a foundation of custom and common law is far more stable than one imposed from above, like that of revolutionary France. Burke developed that idea in a way that inspired generations of British politicians and which encouraged the gradual democratization of our political life. He offered a clear proof that conservatism, when guided by philosophy, can achieve its goal, which is the goal implied in its name, the conservation of an existing social order. This goal is differently conceived in different European countries, for there is no single religious, institutional or legal inheritance. Nevertheless, the basis of conservative philosophy is shared across the continent, not merely to conserve things, of course, but to adapt them so that they survive. This basis is the concept, the basis behind this whole way of thinking is the concept of responsibility. This is not how the conservative message is usually expressed. Ever since the Reagan-Thatcher Risorgimento, conservatives have advocated freedom as their principal value, the goal that distinguishes right from left in the modern world. That emphasis was persuasive in the days of the Soviet Empire, but it is less persuasive today when it is not tyranny but incipient anarchy that is the main cause of popular concern and the principal thing against which the ordinary voter is seeking a remedy. Of course, real freedom is also a condition of self-discipline, and responsibility is a part of it. Freedom and accountability go hand in hand and cannot in the end be distinguished from one another. But the emphasis on responsibility involves a change of message, and this is what I would advocate to conservatives everywhere. It's why, for example, the environmental movement should be understood as part of the conservative cause and not one term in the Red-Green alliance. But that raises the question on which I wish to dwell in this brief talk, the question of loyalty. To think in terms of responsibility is to ask the question, to whom am I accountable? It is to subjugate the I to the we, to set limits to individual ambition on behalf of the collective. And this setting of limits has no motivating force if people cannot identify with a community, a first-person plural, with whose destiny their own success and failure are entwined. We want to renew our communities as communities of law-abiding and accountable citizens, able to make sacrifices for the common good, who will work together to establish common institutions and a shared way of life. In short, we need to renew our legacy of social trust, and we want to achieve this without lapsing into religious or ethnic homogeneity. In other words, while defining the fundamental loyalty as a loyalty to a place, a country, and historical ties, rather than to a faith or a race. And of course, that has become all the more important on account of the mass immigration into European states. This can only be done through the nation state. And to my mind, the revitalizing of the nation state must be the first concern of conservative politics, both at the domestic and the international level. There are those who disagree, of course, and in particular those involved in the networks and businesses that are profiting from the European illusion. But it is an illusion. At a time when communities all over the continent are fragmenting and losing their sense of accountability, the European Union offers nothing save an ever-expanding list of human rights, which citizens of any country can claim against their governments and therefore against their fellow citizens, so adding to the legacy of social and moral distrust. Maybe it will come as a surprise to hear a British conservative, heir to the greatest experiment in liberal government that the world has known, speaking adversely of human rights. But I would only emphasize that this concept and the means to make it a reality through international courts has been hijacked by the same forces that have undermined education and the old rule of charity, forces that prefer equality to freedom and anarchy to hierarchy when the choice must be made. Only in the context of a nation-state proud of its identity and able to offer a shared home to its citizens does the idea of a right make sense. For then it is a claim that must be paid for by obedience. In the national context, rights and duties remain indissoluble, sustained by a common obedience and a shared loyalty to one's fellow citizens. For conservatives, all disputes over law, liberty and justice are addressed to a historic and existing community. The root of politics, they believe, is a settlement, the motive in human beings that binds them to the place, the customs, the history and the people that are theirs. The language of politics is spoken in the first person plural, and for conservatives, the duty of the politician is to maintain this first person plural in being. Without it, law becomes an alien imposition, not ours, but theirs, like the laws imposed by a conquering power, or those, as we have experienced in Britain, imposed by a treaty made years ago in a vanished situation by people long since dead. Those who dismiss conservatism in the name of the universal ideals of the Enlightenment have a tendency to forget that governments are elected by a specific people in a specific place and must meet the people's needs, including the most important of their needs, which is the need to trust their neighbours. That is why in all the post-war political debates in European countries, conservatives have emphasised the defence of the homeland, the maintenance of national borders, and the unity and integrity of the nation. And this is also a point of tension in conservatism, since belief in a free economy and free trade inevitably clashes with local attachments and community protection. We are living now through the latest eruption of this tension. It was in the name of their social and political inheritance that conservatives fixed their banner to the mast of freedom. What they meant was this kind of freedom, the freedom enshrined in our legal and political inheritance and in the free associations through which our societies renew their legacy of trust. So understood, freedom is the outcome of multiple agreements over time under an overarching rule of law. And the task of politics is to establish what Hayek called a constitution of liberty. Liberals believe in the right of individuals and communities to define their identity for themselves, regardless of existing norms and customs. They do not see liberty as a shared culture based in tacit conventions. On the left, it is the negative that inspires, and a whole language has developed with which to abuse those who cling, in however dispirited a fashion, to the existing social order, the inherited hierarchies, the old and tried conventions. The isms and phobias are designed to describe our established forms of belonging as forms of exclusion, and so to undermine them. To racism, sexism, ageism, xenophobia, and the rest, we now must add homophobia, transphobia, and Islamophobia. Those words belong to a posture of relentless interrogation, directed towards all that we have by way of a shared experience of belonging. The effect of this is not to amplify freedom, but to curtail it in new and radical ways as people are silenced, shamed, or dismissed from employment for uttering thoughts that have become forbidden. And this is what we are beginning to see as the censorship that begins in the universities spreads to the rest of civil society. Radical Islam, of the reactionary Sunni kind, is able to claim the privilege of a rival identity, a challenge to our rooted ways of belonging. And the response of Western liberals is therefore to insist that nothing should be said, nothing can be said against this way of life. It is a way of life that challenges our way of belonging, but that merely proves that the problem is our way of belonging. Moreover, if the customs of certain Muslim communities seem to violate every precept defended by feminists, for example, this is an illusion born of Islamophobia. As every feminist knows, the culture of male domination is the preserve of comfortable white men in Western democracies. All this reminds us of a remarkable truth, which is that ordinary people in Europe are less afraid of Islamists than they are of liberals, who police their language and their thoughts and ensure that all attempts to affirm our way of life are nipped in the bud. In the face of this, the task of conservatives is surely to defy the censors, to be vigorous in affirming what we are and in shoring up the foundations of our inherited way of belonging, while extending an invitation to rival cultures to seek the compromises necessary to belong with us on the same terms. We should be in the business of instructing the public, and young people in particular, in the virtues of our civilization. We should be teaching pride, not shame, and gratitude, not resentment. And we should do this without denying the faults of our ancestors or the need, where necessary, to mend our ways. Indeed, it is one of the virtues of Western civilization, and a virtue owed largely to its Judeo-Christian inheritance, that we confess to our faults and try as best we can to atone for them. In our time, popes have apologized for the Crusades, archbishops have owned up to the Atlantic slave trade, and churches everywhere have hosted self-accusatory sermons on the oppressions exercised by previous generations of Christians. And so it should be, but so it should be with other cultures too. I do not think, nor have I ever thought, that conservative thinking can be devoted to freedom alone, nor is the agenda about economic freedom. It is about our whole way of being as heirs to a great civilization and a many-layered bequest of laws, institutions, and high culture. To defend that way of being must be our first priority, and this defense cannot be properly conducted through politics alone. We need to uphold the secular law that has come down to us from the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. We need to defend the spiritual wisdom of the Hebrew Bible, the ethic of forgiveness and compassion that was taught to all mankind by Christ, and the spirit of free inquiry that we owe to the Enlightenment. We need to defend, in the face of a growing narcissism, the real and lasting sexual relations on which the future of society depends. Opposition, disagreement, the free expression of dissent, and the rule of compromise all presuppose a shared identity. There has to be a first-person plural, a we, if the many individuals are to stay together, accepting each other's opinions and desires regardless of disagreements. Religion provides such a first-person plural. I might define myself as a Christian or a Muslim, and that might be sufficient to bind me to my fellow believers, even when we disagree on matters of day-to-day government. But that kind of first-person plural does not sit easily with democratic politics. In particular, it does not accept the most fundamental disagreement within the state between the faithful who accept the ruling doctrine and the infidels who don't. We lived through that in the 17th century, and our democracy came into being because we lived through it and rejected it. That is why democracies need a national rather than a religious or an ethnic we. The nation state, as we now conceive it, is the byproduct of human neighborliness, shaped from the countless agreements between people who speak the same language and live side by side. It results from compromises established after many conflicts and expresses the slowly forming agreement among neighbors both to grant each other space and to protect that space as common territory. It has consciously absorbed and adjusted to the ethnic and religious minorities within its territory, as they in turn have adjusted to the nation state. It depends on localized customs and a shared routine of tolerance. Its law is territorial rather than religious, and invokes no source of authority higher than the intangible assets that its people share. It is the nation state, so conceived, that defines the primary goal of conservative politics in our time. Thank you. Now, I have no chairman, so I have to, if any of you want to ask questions or make expressions of defiance, I'll have to choose you. There's a gentleman there, yes, with a beard in the middle.
Sorry.
A microphone there, yes.
I particular interest because I'm a philosophy graduate of Birkbeck. I just started after you left, so we never met at that point. As one of the few conservatives there at the time, I noticed an increasing hostility to any sort of disagreement at all in academia with the bulk, and it's now got to the point where my nephew, who's at university, says it is now impossible to be able to voice any conservative viewpoint whatsoever without even being physically attacked, and they'll look the other way. Have we completely lost control of universities now?
Well, it sounds as though we have. One solution, there are two solutions to this, though. One is to start new universities outside the nexus of state control, which is what happened with Buckingham, founded by Margaret Thatcher, where I do teach a course, and which is going in the right direction, which does have well-known reactionaries like David Starkey talking openly from the platform. So that's a possibility, though of course it's a small gesture. But there's the other way forward, which is to get rid of universities altogether. That's to say, make sure that their sources of funding dry up. They are essentially state-sponsored institutions. Withdrawing the grants that they enjoy would bring them right down to this level at which they are actually approaching. And I think that might be something that we should think about. On the other hand, we don't want to lose all the scientific advances that universities produce and which are necessary to a modern economy. And it could be that we ought to ring-fence the humanities, which after all can enjoy all this bigoted leftism, largely because they make no difference whatsoever to the general economy, and just give support for the sciences. Not an easy question, though, so I don't have an answer. I have thought of setting up a Scrutopian Institute for unorthodox thought, and if the funder comes along, this might happen. Anyway, yes, the gentleman here.
You referred to we.
Oh, yes.
I usually have a voice, but it can carry across Hyde Park. So you referred to we and the identity with we. The situation today, perhaps, with regard to the present European issue, is that the Remainers do not share the we. So can we say the populace has a current polity?
It is a very important question. Has our first person plural disintegrated? That's the question. This was it's not new, this question. It was posed by George Orwell in The Lion and the Unicorn in the course of the Second World War, when he recognized that the intellectuals were bound by their loyalties to the Soviet experiment, and were essentially anti-patriotic, even defending the right of the Germans to attack us, because, after all, there was nothing that we had that we could offer to rival the forms of order that they were promising to us. And I think the intellectuals have always been, not always, but in the modern world, have generally been hostile to the ordinary person. If you look at the literature of French philosophy since 1930s, it's all one long, boring condemnation of the bourgeoisie meaning the ordinary, decent Frenchman. And we are now entering the same position, that our intellectuals define themselves against the loyalties of ordinary people. And Orwell may be right, it needs a war to change that, and we can't afford wars now. So we have to live with this irritating parasite under the skin of ordinary people, constantly chafing away, producing nothing except sores and indignation, and that's perhaps how it should be. Every now and then an intellectual rises from this cauldron of hatred where they all live and says something nice about the ordinary people, as I do, and they rush to push him back down again. So it's a difficult question, but I think people are perhaps too respectful of the elite, and that we do have institutions which enable us to argue with them. Parliament was supposed to be one of them, and has ceased to be so. But I think we can, we've got to start the argument again. This lady here. Yes?
Thank you. My question is about young people. If the surveys are to be believed, they're not particularly religious. In terms of citizenship, they want to be citizens of nowhere and travel, be digital nomads, if you will. In terms of sexuality, an increasing number are not traditional. Thank you. So my question is your position that adults of a certain age should be more proactive and try to change their mind, or is it to accept them and perhaps adapt? Thank you.
It's a very important question. Have we lost contact with the young? And to a certain extent we have, because they have all entered this weird world in which between them and the real world there exists an impassable screen. And on that screen are pictures, and those pictures are of themselves. They reflect their dreams, their fantasies, their existing relationships. And the result is that they are quite divorced from reality, and in particular from the principal reality, which is the reality of social reproduction. Maybe they'll cease having children. It could be, one of the optimistic thoughts is that people who are addicted to Facebook and Twitter and so on cease to reproduce. And the rest of us who don't have social media accounts will then take over. But that may be too simple, but I think you are right. We have to do what we can to bring young people round to accepting their responsibility for others, for the future, and getting out of this narcissistic obsession with your own image on the screen in front of you. Very hard. The gentleman behind, this lady behind, sorry, these lights shining in my eyes forbid me from seeing you.
You were speaking about renewing nationalism, the nation state,
Yeah.
and renewing the sense of belonging and the we. But so much has been destroyed, and especially as apparent when you look at the behaviour of people in Parliament and
Yes.
the elite. And so much has been lost of understanding of our own history. What basis, what foundation do we have to move forward? What kind of renaissance is possible, given how much has been lost?
Yes. Well, these are devastating questions. If I thought that so much had been lost that nothing could be renewed, then that would be it. Like Voltaire, I'd go back to cultivate my garden. But I don't think it's as bad as that. I think there are good teachers out there who know what they should be teaching. There are good schools. There are people who are giving them their time and energy to setting an example to younger people and to the nation as a whole. So I think one has to believe in that, and after all, it's up to you to act in that way. Despair breeds despair, but one little gesture of hope brings hope with it for others, and I think that's what one has to do. We have a wonderful legacy of charitable and public-spirited action in this country. Institutions everywhere founded for the sake of others rather than your own self-aggrandizement. To get back to that shouldn't be impossible, and to start doing it in such a way that the nation as a whole joins in, that surely is what we must do. There isn't an alternative, that's the point. Well, there is an alternative, which is to hand over everything to the bureaucracy who does it for us and, as it were, depersonalizes us, leaves us as dependents on this abstract machine, and we don't want that. There's a gentleman here. Yeah. There's a microphone should come your way. Has the microphone? Here we are.
My question is, you talk about conservatism and conservative ideas and the laws of conservatism. But don't you think that conservatism has to do a sort of mea culpa? Because when you talk about internet and mass media and the fact that the young are very much in their own world, connected to somebody else that they don't even see ever, the fact that economic policy of many decades has been identified as very materialistic rather than social is not one of the reasons why society and social values have been lost?
Yes, and this is an objection that is constantly made to conservative politics, that it has been too closely allied with the free market and also with global trade and has conspired with the multinational businesses to wipe away the obstacles for the movement of capital around the globe, etc. And this is entirely true. That has happened, and that conservative politicians, in their enthusiasm for the market, have overstepped national boundaries and aligned themselves with these transnational forces. I think this is absolutely true and underlies the great divide in the Conservative Party. The Remainers in the Conservative Party are all locked into that global economy. Whereas the Brexiteers are people who see the free market as something that should be constrained by natural boundaries. And I'm of the second persuasion. I think the market should be constrained, and in traditional societies always was constrained by religious, moral, and customary boundaries to be a local thing. A thing that happens between us. It's a way of agreeing over the economic questions that we collectively confront. And we can see this for, why has there always been constraints on prostitution, for instance? The thought is, here is something sacred that should not be put on sale. That's a boundary to the market. You may say that boundary is becoming flimsy, but still, people will immediately understand that. They will understand that there are boundaries. Slavery was another boundary. For a while, people didn't see that this was a real boundary to the market. The market in people was very powerful in Africa during the 18th and 19th centuries, but very soon people saw that there was something that undermining the whole sense of humanity in this. So it was stopped. And I think we have to recognize that we have a duty in that way to police the market and say this should not be part of it. This should not be part of it. And of course the internet has produced this vast unpoliced arena in which young people go unprotected and are immediately swept up by forces that destroy their natural loyalties and the normal boundaries on which they depend. And that's something we have to address. How could we police this thing? And I can't give my complete answer just now, but in 5 years' time, it'll all be ready. One more question. There's one more question here.
Patrick Deneen published Why Liberalism Failed last year. Do you think liberalism has failed?
So, published?
Why Liberalism Failed.
Yes.
Do you agree with him that it has failed and that both sides of the political spectrum are basically just variations on liberalism?
Well, it's an interesting thesis. What I would say about that book is that it sees politics as though it were the expression and the result of ideas. So there are ideas being put to the test, and then the ideas are refuted, and what we need is other ideas. This, to me, is the kind of déformation professionnelle of university professors, that they think that what they're thinking about is the most important matter. It could be that ideas are much less important than Patrick Deneen thinks. I mean, I have a vested interest in thinking that ideas are really important and that all that I've said today will sink in and you'll stream out of this building waiting to newly take possession of our country and reform it. But I know you won't. You'll go out and you'll have a drink, and tomorrow you might remember some of it. But anyway, we got to the end of the session, so thank you.